Welcome, Bindigin. Ani Bojo, Tammy Hardwick Dishmitas, Adawa Anishinabe, Shishigwaning, Marodo Medicine, Makwadodem, Georgetown Donjaba. So I'm just introducing myself, and it's a really important part. So I introduce you in Anishinaabe in the Odawa dialect, and that language family is very similar and can stretch across a good part into the prairies and just around the Rocky Mountain area. It'll change though, like the dialect changes, but you still may be able to understand some words, but things will be pronounced slightly differently. So when I introduced myself, I said Tammy Hardwick Dishnikas. My name is Tammy Hardwick. And then I said Odawa Anishinaabe, so I am Odawa, but I am also white ancestry. My dad is from Toronto area, British background. And my mom is Odawa from Shishigwaning, Manitoulin Island. That's a First Nation community, so a reserve, you might know it as. And that's on Manitoulin Island. It's my favorite place in the whole world. I love going there. I can't wait to go. I try to get there as often as I can, because it feels like home to me, being in my community and being with all my family members. And I also said that I'm of the Bear Clan, Makwadodem. So that's also an important part of who I am. Traditionally, each clan had its own role within our community. So you were responsible for different things, and people of the Bear Clan were responsible for knowing and understanding the medicines, but also keeping that security of the community. I don't know a lot of that, traditional knowledge wasn't passed down, and I'll get into some of the reason why that traditional knowledge didn't end up always being passed down to the next generation. And so that's also passed down. Sometimes things are passed down through the father's side and some are passed through the mother's side, so matrilineal or patrilineal, and this one is patrilineal. If you Haudenosaunee are matrilineal, so the clan system passes down that way. So just a bit of a difference in remembering that, very, very diverse, many languages, many cultural beliefs and traditions that are unique to each First Nation community and Métis communities and Inuit as well. So to get things started, aside from who I am, I'm also the instructional program lead for First Nation Métis Inuit education, K-12 within Halton District School Board. So that means I have a very big role. Oh, we just went to sleep. And I have to log back in. There we go. Hi. So I have a large role within Halton District School Board, and that involves working at the system level, so ensuring that we're educating the educators, right? So all of our teachers are receiving a great deal of knowledge about Indigenous education and understanding that truth and the history, and also working with teachers in classrooms, helping to develop programming within the schools. And also sometimes I get to go into the classroom and work with students directly, which is a lot of fun. So that's a bit of what we do, or what I do. So this morning, you saw the Honoring the Land and Territory. And I know that our PIC chair ended up explaining a little bit about that. So this is something that that we have available for all of our schools. Generally see perhaps in a larger assembly setting. Some schools do announce it daily on their announcements. But there's a reason for doing this. And that has to do with having an understanding who we are within what we now know today as Canada, but understanding that there were people who were here before colonization ended up happening. So it's about respecting that and honoring it. It's not about, we're not worried that we're going to take all the land back, right? We know that that the reality of today is that that the land is the way it is. We have cities, we have communities that are now built within traditional territories, but I think it's important that we acknowledge and we're aware that people lived here first before this ended up happening. So this is a map I like to show Turtle Island. So this is what many First Nations communities refer to as North America. They refer to it as Turtle Island. You can almost see a little bit of the shape here too. If you're looking, the tail, the legs, the head. And this gives you an idea. Not all of these are names that are would be in an Indigenous language. A lot of them are colonial terms, and we're trying to reclaim what our original terms were. So when you're, for example, you hear the term Iroquois, that's a colonial term. The term Haudenosaunee is what people would want to be called. And we'll get into a little bit of terminology as well. So just an idea that, you know, people occupied the land in the area prior to contact. So as history progressed, we had early treaties. And this one is in 1613. So this one was done with good intent, right? This was about friendship, a treaty of peace and a treaty of friendship. So one row here is the canoe, one row is the ship, and these ones represent peace, love, and friendship. And the idea here was that we were going to live our lives without interfering with one another. We would share the land, but we wouldn't interfere with what our cultures and our traditions were. We were able to live freely. So that was the idea of one of the early treaties. And then later on, we know history sort of unleashed itself, and policies were put in place and imposed upon Indigenous people, and I'll get into that as we move along here. So then we ended up with treaty areas as colonization progressed. So you're thinking about, you know, you had the early fur trade. So fur trade was going really well, making lots of money, right? Then you had fighting over land and territory, and then the realization that now, you know, the government in Britain, they decreed that under the Royal Proclamation that you had to create treaties if you were going to move through the land and build and develop. They weren't always done honorably, and there wasn't a lot of choice. Many of them were done where they were signed for, so they were like forged signatures. So it wasn't always done with truth, honor, and respect, or in peace and friendship. So eventually you have the landmass of what we now know today as Canada, which is covered in numbered treaties, and also you have treaties that are named, they're not numbered. It is important to note that some areas were not signed in treaty, and there are still, for example, Wickwamacong on Manitoulin Island is an unceded First Nation, so that means that they never signed a treaty. And there are other areas in BC as well, and in the north. So what I would like to do is to get into a little bit about terminology. And this can be a really difficult one. You hear different terms in the news, you hear different things that people say, and you hear things in the media, and you also might hear people say themselves, right? You hear that different language, and you're always not quite sure, what am I supposed to say? What's the proper term? And a lot of it, you have difficulties because in such things as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, it says Aboriginal in here, right? But what language, what term are you more commonly hearing the government use today? Indigenous. Yeah, absolutely. You hear Indigenous. This was written before they ended up moving to the term Indigenous. So I'll go through a bit of that. And first of all, we have Aboriginal. Umbrella term referring to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So this was actually put into the Constitution in 1982. So that's how that term came to be. We were not asked, what do you want to be called? It was one of those terms that ends up becoming imposed, right? If you look at a lot of names, here, First Nations, not asked, what do you want to be called, once again. So First Nation also is a term that refers to a reserved community, but also refers to someone who is a First Nation person. So I'm First Nation ancestry, for example. My First Nation is Shishigwani. So that's the community that my family is from. And it's important to know that there are 634 First Nations in Canada, but this is reserved communities, okay? This is where it becomes a little bit tricky. But if we go back here and we look at our Turtle Island map, remember when I said you probably will hear a language similar to how I spoke at the beginning, Anishinaabe? So you would hear that all along here. We're thinking Anishinaabe people. Cree has some similarities. It's like in a language family, but I wouldn't be able to converse directly with someone who was a language speaker. I'm not a fluent language speaker. I know just a little bit here and there. I can understand more when I'm listening to what my grandma's saying and my mom and my aunts and uncles, and I'll catch a few things here and there. So just an example that we had names. So Anishinaabe was named, Haudenosaunee was named. At any time, if you have a question, please ask, okay? Because I don't want your thought to go away. So let's get back to terminology. So that's what I mean by First Nation. Métis. Métis people are First Nation and European descent from the early fur trade. Métis have a common culture, history, and political tradition, and are connected through kin relations. It's important to know that this is a distinct culture and language that Métis people have. Some people might identify as Métis that don't go back to the roots of the Métis Nation when you're thinking about Louis Riel. So it's about how someone identifies, and it's not for anyone to say, well, you know, I don't think you're right. It's about how you identify. And that's the thing, when you're Indigenous, it's often put into question, well, you know, maybe you don't look like you are, but then I don't say to someone who says, oh, you know, I'm German ancestry. And I'm like, well, how do I know that? You don't look like it. You know, that's never a question that someone says to someone. But I get that question. I've had it many times where, oh, but you don't look like it. But this is how I identify, and this is who I am. But other, you know, people often don't see that or think that, you know, it becomes applicable only to Indigenous people that you can ask that question or say, you know, you don't look it. And so just remembering that people identify how they are, and that's really important.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So, are we no longer to use the term Aboriginal?
So my suggestion would be that if you're looking for an umbrella term, that you're going to use the term Indigenous. I know that the Anishinaabe Nation had asked years ago for people to stop using the term Aboriginal. But yet, because like I said, it's written in Section 35, so it continued to be used because that's the language that the government is using, right? So once again, without asking, but Anishinaabe Nation, which is a large body of I'm going to get this wrong, the 27 First Nation communities, they asked to stop using it because of the term you know, thinking abnormal. It was a term that we didn't ask for. We want to be known as our nations, not as Aboriginal, right? Because when you think about Europe, not everybody is European, right? You want to be identified as your distinct people.
Yes, I know Professor Dawn. I work with her, and she has a project at Rubicon in Alberta.
Yeah.
So she explained to me that it has a derogative term. that's why the First Nation Métis and the Indigenous people don't want it to be used, moving forward, because it does have a derivative term, like when we talk about the Aboriginal in Australia or the Aboriginal in the islands toward Australia. So that's what they're trying to avoid. And moving forward, they want the word Aboriginal to be stopped and the Indigenous people to be used instead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I would agree. And then it's almost a shame that it's in here, in the TRC Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. But just because it's written in here doesn't mean that you can't change the terminology that you use. And even educating others to ensure that, the proper terms end up being utilized in your conversations, and, interrupt people so that you change that conversation. So Inuit refers to, it actually translates to the people. So if you say Inuit person, you're Inuit people, you're kind of saying the same thing twice. So we think about the Arctic region, and singular is Inuk. So if you're talking to one person, you would say Inuk instead of Inuit, because that's the plural. So Indigenous. So we just talked about that, I think we all know here from everybody's feedback that Indigenous is the term that is more appropriate to use today. However, I would encourage you to use the term, like if you're thinking you want to talk about me, I'm Anishinaabe, okay? That's what I would prefer instead of Indigenous, because when you're talking Indigenous, you're talking about First Nations, Inuit, Métis. It's an umbrella term. It's a really large one. So be as specific as possible. And this is also a preferred term. I know when you were speaking about your friend that you were talking to. Yeah. So this is also preferred because under the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People, that term is used. So when we're thinking about rights, we want to ensure that we're identified as Indigenous so that those rights are followed and honored. The human rights. So I have this little video clip that I thought I'd play. Maybe we'll sum it up just a little bit. This was created by someone from CBC. Of course, we get a little commercial first.
Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Aboriginal. There are so many different terms out there that it can be kind of confusing if you don't know what they all mean. But actually, it might be simpler than you think. I'm Ozzy Michelin, and I'm an Inuk journalist from Northwest River, Labrador, and I'm here to teach you how to talk about Indigenous people in Canada. Let's start with the term Indigenous. According to the United Nations, there are 370 million Indigenous people worldwide, spread across 70 countries. In Canada, there are approximately 1.4 million people who identify as Indigenous. Here, there are three distinct groups that make up the term Indigenous: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. First Nations is the largest and most varied group of Indigenous people, and they can be found from coast to coast to coast. Sometimes I hear people using the term Indigenous and First Nations as if they were interchangeable, but they're not. Using Indigenous when you're referring to a specific group is kind of like saying Asian when you're referring to the Vietnamese or South Korean. It works sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it just sounds wrong. The rule of thumb is to be as specific as possible. If somebody is Cree, it's okay to refer to them as being Cree, and if you don't know, ask them how they self-identify. Next are the Métis. The Métis are the descendants of First Nations and European settlers, and often referred to a distinct geographic group coming from the historic Northwest. You can find Métis all across Canada, but they all share a unique, distinct cultural heritage. The Inuit are the maritime circumpolar people of Canada, with a homeland stretching all the way from Siberia to Greenland. In Canada, there are 4 Inuit homelands, but they're not all just north of 60, with populations in both Quebec and Labrador. In the Inuit language, Inuktitut, the word Inuit means people. And you might have heard the term Inuk before. Inuk means person. So remember, it's one Inuk, many Inuit. And don't say Inuit people, because that's redundant. So that's it for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But what about Aboriginal? Do we still even use that term? Well, generally, no. It's out there still, but it's being replaced by Indigenous, which is an internationally used term. So remember these simple rules if you want to get it right. Be as specific as possible. If you're referring to one person or one community, then name it. If there's more than one community or people, then use the broader terms like First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. If there are different groups together, then say Indigenous. And if you don't know, ask. Most people are happy to tell you about where they're from, and where their parents are from, and where their grandparents are from, and where their whole family is from. That's kind of how it works in the Indigenous world. Thanks. I hope that helps. Back to you next.
All right. I hope that helped. Yeah. Any questions so far? All right, we're good? Okay, we'll move forward. Now that we talked a little bit about terminology, which is a tough one, I know. So what I want to talk to you today about mostly is truth. So we're really going to get into that history and the effects of colonization. So we're talking about the truth and reconciliation and why knowing that is important. And just remember, you know, we're all here to learn. I didn't even learn this in high school. It was hidden, even in my own family. So, so don't worry if perhaps you didn't have that knowledge when you were in school. It's not about blame, it's not about guilt, but it's about taking the time and being here in this moment and learning the truth now. And then what you end up doing with that truth. So first of all, I want to bring things to contemporary realities and understanding our history to take action today. So there's this here, and I think you remember last year there was a lot of talk in the news about mascots, right? And how we use them. So Cleveland, I'm not even going to say the name, continues to use this image. And thinking about, you know, can you imagine if we had, you know, taken cultures and put them in a mascot, and the argument is that this is honoring. It's not honoring. And thinking that would this be able to take place if we were taking other cultures and placing them on shirts, on major league teams, and having them out there, and the chanting that goes on. And it's really harmful, it's damaging. I think it hurts. It's something that I really hate seeing in sports teams, period.
That's a good question.
Yes.
Why do you feel that way? Why would you see it as a negative as opposed to a positive, you know, trying to embrace the culture and diversity? Because I've been thinking a little bit about this because of that guideline that went out for Halloween costumes.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I
that's
found that interesting. Culturally insensitive, you know, costumes
Yeah.
will not be permitted.
Yes, I can address both of those. So for myself, I'm thinking about the fact that when this team was created, it was done in, I think it was somewhere in the 1920s. And let's think about the history of that time period. What was actually going on? Were we actually honoring when we know that children were in residential schools? They were being taken from their families. You had laws that were imposed and policies in place. And if you wanted to honor, then maybe laws shouldn't have been created at that time, right? We should have been embracing the culture and diversity and not putting it as a symbol. That's a caricature, for one. You know, this doesn't look like anyone that I know. So not only does it do that, and then you're taking the term Indian, which is still used in government policy today when you're thinking about the Indian Act. That's probably the only time that you can use that term is when you're referring to it in a historical document. So for one, we have this term, which has no reflection. This was a term that was created because people thought of a mistake of where they landed, they arrived, right? And then when you're referring to costumes, right, Halloween costumes, look at me, look at how I'm dressed, and I'm wearing clothes as you are. If I were to wear what we call regalia, that would be done in a traditional way through ceremony. And ceremonies are very important, and we don't want to minimize that. We don't want to mock it and disrespect it. So I see when people want to dress up as people's cultures, then I see that as offensive. I know some people may say, well, maybe you want to do that in a respectful way. But I don't, that's not an opportunity to do it in a respectful way. You don't want to appropriate a culture. You want to learn about it. You know, you can learn all you can, but understand that this is someone else's identity and who they are, right? Until you you learn, and perhaps you sit with elders and you learn many traditional teachings, and that elder might say, I've gifted you this knowledge, and now you can share that knowledge. That would be the only time it would be okay to share a part of culture. And when I look in Halloween costume stores, what do you see? Look at the titles of them, and you might see something that says Pokahati, right? Do you really want to sexualize someone, knowing that Indigenous women and girls go missing and are murdered, right? So it's also a sexualizing someone when there's so much violence that's happening against Indigenous women and girls. And there are many other costumes. So you have people who are mocking stereotypes, for what? Ones that you might have seen in Hollywood, where there was this whole pan-Indianism, right? So you have one costume for every nation. So everyone holds a tomahawk, everyone wears a headdress when it has nothing to do with that nation's culture and their identity. So that's why I find wearing a costume very dangerous, and also why I find sports imagery to be dangerous as well. And when you look at a team like the Washington Redskins, if you understand what that term Redskin means, then I think you would also have that feeling as well. So the term Redskin actually came out of bounties. So bounties would be posted in papers, and there's actual primary documentation to show this, that would ask for the scalp of any Indigenous person. Of course, the language was different then. So they're asking for that, and you got paid for every scalp. So when you hear the term scalping, it's the reverse that started. It was the colonizers that scalped and collected bounty for every person they killed that was Indigenous. So that's why the term Redskin is so offensive and hurtful. Any questions or comments?
Yeah. Something that
Absolutely.
it's just a comment. A lot of times people ask the question, why is there this discussion going on? And I'll just give you an example of the time when we had the Conservative government, and Jason Kenney brought in the idea that women could not be covered when they're going for the oath. You know, this is an example that I work with. And at a meeting, he staged this act where this woman came in with a burqa. And, you know, there was like, I was at the meeting, there was this loud silence. And he comes and, you know, the woman comes towards him and to shake hands. And he, well, in my opinion, he pretended to be like flabbergasted that this woman who is wearing a burqa is coming to say hello to him, all right? Then he turns and the woman flips the burqa. And this is, you can even see it on YouTube. So for us as Muslims who were there, it was extremely offensive. So sometimes when people talk about why is it so important to you, it's your deeply held belief, regardless of what others say. And this is where the contention comes in. If it's your deeply held belief, nobody has a right to ask you questions. And I think a lot of people miss that or don't understand that, because it's your deeply held belief. You believe in that, and it's your right to believe in that. So I can understand, you know, all this where it's coming from, because, you know, we had the caricature of the prophet, you know, and violence all over the world, you see. So it's your belief, it's your religion, and it's, you know.
Yes.
And we come from all different parts of the world. We need to know each other and understand different perspectives, and then, you know, always show respect.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Knowledge is power for change, right? Yeah.
Just to continue kind of the connection, like I worked for a project that held an event a couple weeks ago. It was about kind of talking about the intersectionality of human rights, poverty, other identity pieces. And one of the sessions that we had was we had Nicole Richmond from Chiefs of Ontario come and talk into a session, and she titled her session "Everything You Wanted to Know About Indigenous People That We're Kind of Afraid to Ask."
Yeah.
And I just thought that was beautiful because my humble opinion is I'd rather people ask and surface those kinds of, you know, sometimes I've been in situations where I've listened to an Indigenous speaker and I hear a question and I'm just like, I'm offended for them, even though it's just my raw feeling of, oh my goodness, but the grace with which the speaker accepted the question and tried to, it's challenging. I think in every moment you probably like, you don't want to be that spokesperson or you don't want to, but I really am trying to wrap my head around, like, kind of foster the, like, ask questions, even if you sound wrong, like, because then we can have a conversation. If you never ask, and you just kind of keep those beliefs or things, you know, so, but the honest truth is not every person is going to want to be like, I'm asked things, people question my identity around things. And I'm like, I don't want to be that spokesperson. Yeah. I'm Canadian today, and I don't want to talk about the other pieces, but so just trying to foster that spirit of openness that you're part of my short understanding or reconciliation as I begin to learn on that journey is being able to question. That is the first important step.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I am open to questions today, but I also feel what you said. Sometimes I just want to be Tammy that day. I need a break because sometimes, you know, it takes a lot out of your heart, right? And you got to fill that back up. But you know, as an educator and as someone who identifies as Anishinaabe, I want to make sure that, you know, people know and they have that knowledge so that we can move forward and that we have an understanding of one another, because that's the most important, so that we have that mutual respect. Yeah. So just another piece that goes along the lines of thinking about, you know, contemporary realities here. So here I put in Autumn Pelche, who was talking about pipelines, right? She is a huge advocate for water protection. And she's also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know if I heard what the result was.
Children's Peace Prize.
Yeah, Children's, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know. She's been nominated. I don't know that we've been out.
Yeah, I know it's been, all the Nobel Prizes have been announced slowly over the last week, I think, or a little bit more. So I'm waiting to hear on where she's, but still, what an honor and that recognition that, you know, she's advocating, and this is a youth, and that speaks to the strength of our youth that are coming back and being proud of who they are and really taking a stand. And this one is the Water is Life protest demonstrations that are happening. And it's really important that we see these as, this is about everyone. This just isn't about Indigenous rights, right? Water is important to everyone who is here. So when people are standing up and you see Indigenous people standing and gathering and speaking out, that message is for everyone, and for everyone to take a stand about water. Quite often we'll hear, oh no, there they go again, right? Blocking a roadway, without really understanding the reason why behind it. And that's really important, because that's where your negative stereotypes, your comments, your racism, that starts to come out if you don't have an understanding of why someone might be standing up. This is also Grassy Narrows. Finally, they got an announcement that they will start cleaning up the mercury that was leached into the water, but the children and And community members have long-term effects from that, having that mercury in the water and the poisoning. So I'm sure that it's become into the genetic code, and that'll carry on for generations. When you think about Hiroshima and the atomic bomb, right? You think that's generational impact. That wasn't just killing people in that moment, but the radiation affected people. People were born with birth defects after that, and cancer, more prone to cancers. And I spoke a little bit about this. So missing and murdered Indigenous women. So thinking about that this is a reality today. October 4th was the National Day of Action. Important to me, and I think about my family members who have also gone missing and were murdered. So when you think, those connections are real. So I'm mindful of time. I'm going to just quickly go through some of these slides. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action. Has anyone read it?
Part of it.
Part of it? Yeah. Parts of it you might be aware of, some of it, parts of it. If you haven't, it's okay. There's always time to learn, right? And to have that knowledge. So I brought a copy for everyone. So I will pass it out after, or you'll be able to pick one up on the way. I would read through each one of these because it's really important. It hits on legal systems, it hits on secondary child welfare, education, so what our role is, but also it's important for everyone, right? Because this is about Canada as a whole and what we can do to reconcile what has happened throughout history. So those are there, and like I said, you will see the term Aboriginal written all throughout this. But remember that every single one of those calls to action was written by survivors of residential schools, elders, youth. So there is a reason that every single call is in there, and it has to do with the legacy of colonialism, not just residential schools, but right from the very start. So what I want to do is just cover a timeline of our history. And I'm going back to 1620. This is pre-Confederation, but this is when one of the first residential schools was established. So put that in your mind. What we are taught, right, is at the time of Confederation, we're not taught to look back further. Let's look beyond at the start of contact, the start of colonization. Then 1831, I have the Mohawk Indian Residential School, opens up in Brantford, Ontario. How many people knew we had one that close? Yeah, that's right. This one is still open today. It's under construction, so they're trying to do renovations. And they have Save the Evidence campaign. Many communities where residential schools were built, they were torn down. For obvious reasons, that's a lot of pain, right? But here in Brantford, they actually wanted to keep it as an education piece. So this one remains open. Another one that remains open is at Algoma University, Shingwak Residential School. And and that one is now part of the university campus. But they house a lot of residential school information. So, continuing on, then we have the Gradual Civilization Act. So when, that was lands could only be used for civilized people. So this is how policy ends up making it, okay, well, we know that, the Indigenous people are not civilized, right? They don't follow our practices. So that comes into play. So that there's another reason we can take land, right? Because they're not using it in a civilized way. So we can remove that. Then the Constitution Act. Here, 1872, the Dominion Act. This is when people are encouraged, like Europeans, to come and settle, right? Because the only way to build and claim land is to ensure that people are there. And remember that Indigenous populations didn't count as occupying land. So here, this is a quote that I like to share, and this is a quote by Lord Jeffrey Amherst. I think of Amherstburg. This is what Amherstburg is named after. So it says, infect the Indians with sheets upon which smallpox patients have been lying, or by any other means which may exterminate this accursed race. So yes, actual quote. Now, we know that smallpox could not stay alive on blankets for that length of time in order to be transported, but nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the fact that this was an attempt at germ warfare, right? You can view it that way. So that was the intent, was to kill using smallpox. So here we have those lovely posters, and when we think about how we learn about our, history, when you took Canadian history, so own your own land, own your own home in Canada, ready-made farm. So not even thinking about the fact that who was living there at the time. And this was all a part of let's settle the West, right? Let's build that railroad in, and we need to get people living there so that we can justify building it, and we can make Canada, that big expanse from coast to coast. And so we need to settle. We need to bring in Europeans to do that, because we want to have people who are white coming in and occupying that land. See, this one is even the CNR, the National Railway. So now getting into residential schools, and many of you have probably seen this. Actually, I was pleased to see that that poster is up at the back on this timeline. So there's actually some indication in this room that maybe there's some learning about Indigenous history. I'm assuming this is a history class. So look around. So we have here Thomas More. Now these photographs were taken in order to prove how residential schools were civilizing, right? Civilizing the child. So we look here, dressed up, staged to hold a pistol. This photo is staged. If you're looking at what's being worn, some items that are on here have proven to be not a part of that person's cultural identity. So this is completely staged. And then you look here after he's been in school for a while. Now look at him. We're civilizing this child, right? So that's the impression that they wanted to give off. It's like, propaganda. And in the background here, this is Mohawk Indian Residential School in Brantford. They also called it mush hole, people who attended there, because they were fed mush for every meal. So continuing on, then we have the Indian Act. And this gives the government exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and Indian lands. When the Indian Act still exists today, I am a part of the Indian Act because I am a registered Indian. I have a number that I can rhyme off that identifies me from where my First Nation is. So I go 17800455501. That is my number. 178 is Shishigwani. That is the reserve that I come from. The 455, that's my individual number. And the 01, I am one within that family because I'm over 18. So everybody has that number, and it identifies who you are and where you are from. If you are qualified through blood quantum as a status Indian.
Sorry, you refer to blood quantum?
Yes. So that means that, for example, my father is white, which I shared with you, but my mother is Anishinaabe, so she's full status. So I think of my blood, I'm half, right? If I had a child with someone who is white, then they would not be Indian status. If I had a child with someone who was status, then they would be, because they have enough blood. So under the Indian Act, it comes down to your blood quantum.
So it
But-
has to be at least 50%.
No. Yes.
No,
No,
it's
it's
a
a
quarter,
little-
because my
yeah.
husband is a quarter and he's
Yeah.
Indian. Or, sorry.
Yeah, no, that is the legal term,
Yeah,
right?
I
Under
know,
the
I
law.
know, but it's not right.
But it comes down to, yeah, how much you have. But that doesn't matter, so you should never ask someone You know, are you status? That would be the wrong question to ask, because if somebody identifies as who they are, that's who they are. It doesn't matter if the Canadian government says that's, that you're not or that you are, right? It's about that person's individual identity. So that's really important to take away from that. Never ask someone if they are status.
So is that still true today?
Yes. Yes, it is.
I just have a question.
Yes.
You know, the card.
Yep.
that, Indigenous people carry. Where did that come from, and what was the purpose of having that card?
Well, it comes down to your treaty rights, but it would come down to being able to count the people who were keeping track, right? Yeah, of your numbers, your population. Inuit also had numbered IDs that they had to wear to be kept track
What
of.
about the Indigenous people who did not have treaties with the government? In particular, because I'm talking about the Rubicon area, north of Edmonton, where they have an issue with water. And there's a program that Dr. Dawn and another Muslim lady have created an organization where they're actually going back to Rubicon and creating awareness about the water issue. But those people don't have a treaty with the government. So I just wanted to know what is the difference.
You know, I wouldn't be able to say 100% for sure what it's like in that area. My guess would be that they do have a status, but because treaty rights are not established, then that would go to whatever is happening with that land claims. I couldn't answer you 100%.
Yeah, it's just that I didn't know, and I thought maybe you'd help me. But you know,
Maybe
I always
asking the person.
Yeah, because I always hear they don't have a treaty. They didn't have the treaty.
That's
So
right.
it's just like, for me it's confusing because I thought all
Yes.
the Indigenous people had treaty with the government.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Yeah, and some Métis have treaty rights, but then you have Métis that don't, depending on the area as well. It's very complicated.
Does it affect their status?
Yes.
If you are treaty or non-treaty?
You mean on the card, like specifically? I know that if I'm looking at Wikwamaka, again, speaking from people that I know, we have a status card. Yes.
I'll find out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would hazard a guess that yes, someone who would fall under the Indian Act would have a status card from that area. But as far as treaty rights go, I'm not sure what it would be. You'd have to look specifically to that area to find out. Good questions though, lots of good questions here. So being mindful. So here we go as we're moving along, and we know that students, there's a 1884, so traditional ceremonies are banned. You can't practice any of your spirituality. So this is subject to possibly being put in jail. And we do know that there were, people would go off and try to do it in secluded areas so that, that culture and tradition could be carried on and ceremonies could still be practiced. But if you were caught, you could be put in jail. In 1889, we know that allegations of physical and sexual abuse emerged in a school in Manitoba. So when, government giving an argument that, well, we didn't know that this was happening, they knew very, very early on, and it was well documented. So here, when we're talking about lands reserved for Indians, so remember that map I showed you of Turtle Island, and you're thinking about where, the different nations lived, and then it became 1/10 of 1% of Canada's landmass. So that's where all reserves are. These little dots become reserve areas. Very spread out. You're limited and restricted to your movement as well. So, and this would be like this here. So in 1906, Indigenous peoples can be removed from reserves near towns with more than 8,000 inhabitants. So, moving people away from those communities. I know there were some communities on Manitoulin Island, there were more reserve communities, and they're not there anymore. And I often wondered if it was because of this that they ended up being moved a little further away because there was a town that was located really close by. So in 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott makes residential school attendance compulsory for children 7 to 15 years, although we know that some babies were there and children who were much younger attended residential school. In 1927, there's an amendment to the Indian Act. So then it becomes illegal for Indigenous people to go to court, basically, to try to fight. So you have no right within the court system. So you still have people, right, that are resisting, that are speaking out, but policies are being put in place all along the way to prevent any of these things from happening. So as we move along, residential schools become expanded, and then 1996, you have the last residential school that closes. So this is Shingwalk Residential School. This is the one I told you about that is a part of Algoma University. So this is the school that my grandfather attended. So he went to Shingwalk. He never spoke about stories. The only thing he ever said was, I learned to read and write in English. That's all he ever shared. So I don't really know much more about the experience that he had. But I do know that they made sure that their children did not go to residential school. So what they did is, my mother is one of 12 children. Yeah, it's an awesome family.
I come from a family of 12.
Yeah.
That's why I smiled at you.
Yeah, it's great. So when the Indian agents they'd find out they're coming to the reserve, right? And the Indian agents would come to take the children away, check in, and if they found cause to take children, then they would remove them from, and it didn't take much to find cause, right? It was about assimilation. It was about removing the Indian from the child. So what happened is my mom and her brothers and sisters that were born at this time would be told to go and hide in the woods. So they would hide in the woods until the Indian agents left. And that's a common story that you'll hear in many communities of how to escape from being sent to residential school or being taken by child welfare. So this is a map of residential schools all over, and you can also ask yourself if at this time you could build residential schools in all of these areas, why can't you bring safe drinking water to many communities today, right? You found a way when you wanted to assimilate, but when it comes to people's health and well-being, you find excuses not to. Am I okay? Yeah. Duncan Campbell Scott. So when it was known in 1907 that up to 70% of children were dying in some schools, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs stated, "This alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem." So this is, entrenched in, yes it is, thank you. She said genocide. My next slide. So this is the definition of genocide. So any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So killing members of the group. So we know that this happened early on, especially. Think about the smallpox blankets, right? That intent was there. Within residential schools, we know that children were dying, yet there was still no move to prevent that. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So yes, in residential school, we know that children were abused, physically, sexually, emotionally, punished for speaking your language, having your identity stripped of you as soon as you enter. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Same thing. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Forced sterilization did happen. And still coerced sterilization often happens today with women going into hospitals who are Indigenous and who are like under, drugs from, giving birth, and then end up being coerced into tying their tubes, having there's actual cases that were just brought up in the news recently. I think like 2 days ago I heard on CBC they were talking about a case. So you can look that up, it still happens. And forcibly
Still
transferred
happens,
children.
So it still happens nowadays.
It doesn't
Or
happen,
has happened
it
in the
happens
past.
through systemic racism, right? So people's preconceived ideas on childcare, if you're able to take care of your child, right? So through history, that it has gone into the systems, all of our child welfare systems. There's more children in care today than residential school children, than children who are attending residential school. And that all has to do with this history. So we have to break all of these stereotypes down, challenge the oppressive measures that have been put in place in order to change the way that, Indigenous people are seen.
Good morning. Good morning. We just want to let everyone know that session 1 is now ending and lunch will be served in gyms 2 and 3. So session 1 is just ending and lunch will be served in gyms 2 and 3. That's the same area where our speaker was. Thank you.
Okay. So there's my evidence, and then I spoke about it. And the legacy. So you think about that legacy that leaves behind. But I also want you to remember that, I told you my grandfather went to residential school, right? And always remember that each family is going to deal differently and come out of it differently. Think about Candy's talk, right? Think about the experiences that her father had, and then how you deal and how you come out of things and move on. So thinking that, look, I'm here today, I'm able to share this information. I'm able to also go back and try to learn a little bit more about my culture, right? That was taken from me through intergenerational impacts of residential school. But I look back now, my mother, she's a fluent language speaker. 9 of the 12 children are fluent speakers, which is pretty amazing. But our traditions were all passed on. So my mother has learned many of those traditions, and she's considered an elder and carries those forward. And I try to learn as much as I can from her and other elders within our communities.